Hello everybody, welcome to The Loft, which is wonderful and warm tonight. I'm Dan, for those who don't know me, and we are in this series here, How Not to Read the Bible. And as we heard from Cabe when he first spoke to us about this, that the Bible is a library of books telling one unified story that leads to Jesus. So we know that, but we also know there are people who try to use the Bible to, put verses out of context to create narratives to basically lead people away from faith. You know, they might say, look, the Bible is anti-woman, the Bible is pro-slavery, etc., etc. And these are put out often by people who would be considered the new atheists, who may have a following on social media and so forth. And they're sort of they think their clever effort is to get people offside, and often people don't know how to answer these questions. Is the Bible anti-woman and so forth? So tonight we have an interesting topic to deal with, and tonight's topic is: does the Bible condone slavery? So thank you for that easy topic. But this is something that's put out by such new atheist intellectuals as Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and I know you think I'm being very pseudo-intellectual being able to cite those, because I know you'll have others that you could cite that would be far more highbrow. I understand that. So let's try and deal with that in substance tonight, and perhaps a good place to start is with creation and with God and the way God made people. So we know that God did not create slavery. Genesis 1, Genesis 2, there's no slavery. That nobody is created any better than any other person. No race is better than any other race. Nobody is superior. And this is said well in Genesis 1:27. Ruel's here somewhere. So, the image of God. And so, dignity and value is very much stripped away whenever there is slavery. And, slavery comes in, with the fall of man as part of the sinful nature, part of the depravity of man, that slavery would come into existence. So, slavery existed long before Israel, long before Moses. But the Bible itself is actually responsible for the elimination of slavery, not its establishment. In the ancient world, if you were a slave, you were someone's property. You were owned outright. You had no rights. It was a very depraved way of living. And someone owning people as slaves was very normative living, and harsh slavery was normative. And when God started to speak into that, he actually came to deconstruct slavery as it already existed, as created by man and not as created by God. And we see Exodus 21 verses 2-4. It says, "If you buy a Hebrew servant, he is to serve you for 6 years, but in the 7th year he shall go free without paying anything." So here's God starting to deconstruct slavery, starting to take the monkey wrench to the bolts at the base of slavery and starting to loosen the nuts. Charles Spurgeon says of this verse and others that Moses didn't institute slavery in any shape. The laws concerning it were made on purpose to repress it, to confine it, and ultimately to end it. God is moving the trajectory of the story forward quite methodically. So, we see God liberating people. He talks about how if an owner of a slave knocks out their eye, or even if it knocks out their tooth, so in recompense for the tooth being knocked out, that slave needed to be set free. How liberating is that? That's very contrary to what was going on at the time. And it shows God's heart towards people. And one of the other things that we see here is that there was a fair bit of economic slavery going on, and that's what was being spoken about here. People who would sell themselves, perhaps to unburden themselves from overwhelming debt. They would sell themselves, to be servants, and would live in that servant or slave master relationship. Deuteronomy 15 tells us more of God's heart and God's love for people, about how you should let a slave go after the 6 years. Darcy?
Yeah, sorry. Deuteronomy 15 from 12. If your brother, a Hebrew man or a Hebrew woman, is sold to you, he shall serve you 6 years, and in the 7th year you shall let him go free from you. And when you let him go free from you, you shall not let him go empty-handed. You shall furnish him liberally out of your flock, out of your threshing floor, and out of your winepress. As the Lord your God has blessed you, you shall give to him. You shall remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God redeemed you. Therefore, I command you this today.
So that's an incredible break with the practice that when you let your slave go, you send them off with great food and the best wine. So that's economic slavery. When we think about slavery, and when Koshi says the Bible condones slavery, what are you thinking about, and what is Koshi talking about? Well, I think what the slur is that the Bible somehow authorises what was known as the transatlantic African slave trade that operated between the middle 1500s to the middle 1800s. Some 12 million slaves being moved from Africa to America, to the Caribbean, Jamaica, to England. That the slur is, well, God approves of that. The Bible condones that. It absolutely doesn't. And the Bible quite forcefully is against that. And we see that from these same passages in Exodus 21. Exodus 21:16 says, anyone who kidnaps someone is to be put to death, whether the victim has been sold or is still in the kidnapper's possession. And so that verse explains that anyone who kidnaps somebody to sell, they are worthy of the death penalty, and anyone who is in possession of someone kidnapped is also worthy of the death penalty. So the Bible is very clear that the American slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade, is an abomination to God, and everyone involved in it in Exodus was worthy of capital punishment. God took it that seriously. So we can look at some of the differences, and we have, between the Old Testament economic slavery and the transatlantic slavery. Here are some more. In the Old Testament, runaway slaves were to be protected and given freedom. And we've talked about the maximum duration for indebtedness was 6 years. And sometimes slaves said, look, I actually like it here, I want to stay. And you might remember they were given like an ear piercing to stay. They say, okay, I'm going to stay, I'm going to be a permanent slave. Well, even they had to be let go at the 50th year, the year of Jubilee. So, God is a liberator. It's interesting that, nothing that happened under God's regulations came anything close to the transatlantic slave trade. And we kind of know, because we have a conscience, we know that slavery is wrong, because our conscience tells us that. We don't need Richard Dawkins, and we don't need Koshi to tell us that that is wrong. Let's think about Joseph. Joseph is an example of somebody who was sold into slavery by his brothers. You'll recall that he was, I think he was his father's favourite, and he went out to talk to the other 11 who weren't that keen on Joseph because he was so favoured. And they said, look, let's kill him. And Reuben, the eldest brother, said, no, don't do that. Let's put him in a pit instead. And Reuben's idea, by the way, was to actually get him out of the pit and send him back home to Dad. That was his plan. Anyway, while Reuben was away, the other 10 see some Midian traders come along, like in some sort of caravan. And they said, great, we've got an idea, better idea. Let's sell him. Let's not kill him. And they sold him for 20 shekels of silver. And so Joseph heads off. The boys sit down. They have lunch. Reuben comes back and says, hey, where is he? He's not in the hole. And he was very upset about what had happened. He wasn't part of the conspiracy. We know that Joseph was sold, ultimately sold to a captain, and was successful in all the different circumstances that he faced in Egypt, so much so that he became the prime minister. He became the person that had the wisdom to stock up the grain in the quieter times so there was abundance, so there was some supply. Let me reverse that. He stocked up the grain in the abundant times so that there was something to feed the people in the lean times that were coming. And when those lean times came, you had a situation where the brothers headed over to see Joseph. So in fact, 10 boys arrive, and Joseph recognises them. They don't recognise Joseph. And Joseph says, you are spies. That's why you're here. You're here to spy out the land. And they say, no, you've got it wrong. We are honest men. We've got a dad at home. We've got a younger son at home. We've got one brother who's no more. And then there's us. We've just come here to get some food. He said, no, you are spies. He puts them in jail. And shortly after he says, look, if you want to prove that you are not spies, you go back and get that younger son and bring him back here. And that's a terribly confusing, difficult situation these boys have got themselves into. So Joseph can hear this whole story about the way these boys are talking about the sorry mess they're in. But this was 22 years after they sold him into slavery, and their conscience was telling them, hey, this is the reason we are in so much trouble is because we once sold our brother Joseph. They weren't connecting him to that guy, but they knew that they had committed a sin and it was catching up with them. And that's what they attributed it to. So our conscience clearly tells us that, selling people, kidnapping, selling people is absolutely wrong. And good on Reuben, who wasn't to blame for this. There's a commentator, Jesse Johnson, who talks about how while the Old Testament is very clear in condemning any slavery like the transatlantic slave trade, so is the New Testament. Because the New Testament talked about a Roman practice referred to as man-stealing, sometimes referred to as kidnapping, sometimes referred to as enslavers. And it's in 1 Timothy 1, chapter 10. So it's a list of people who will not enter the kingdom of God. Slave traders are among those. And that's because it's a very repulsive form of a breach of the 8th commandment, thou shalt not steal. So anyone who argues that the Bible justifies something like the transatlantic slave trade is completely wrong. This is not a grey area. And anybody involved in that, Paul said, were unrighteous and couldn't inherit the kingdom of heaven. Thinking about the New Testament times, we know of someone who owned servants, Philemon, who were referred to as slaves. He had a slave, an economic slave, named Onesimus. Onesimus ran away. I think he might have taken some money from Philemon. He ran into Paul. He became a Christian, and Paul sent him back to Philemon and said, I want you to make him, receive him back not as a slave, but more than that, as a brother. So Paul was, undermining even that economic slavery by going to the hearts of men. So Paul was no fan of slavery and sought to undermine it. Some of this work is quite indirect. It's very much getting underneath and destabilising it from underneath. Let's talk a little bit about the transatlantic slave trade. So it operated between 1522 and 1866, and there were about 12.5 million Africans shipped to North America, Caribbean and South America. Only 10.7 million survived that journey in the slave ships. We have a picture of a ship called the Brooke, which was a slave ship. And this was a very widely copied image, and it was used by those who campaigned against the slave trade, and it was created in 1787. And it shows how the Africans were transported. That ship is depicted as loaded to its full capacity, 454 people crammed into the hold. And, you know, the Caribbeans, they were basically in the sugar plantations, which was very, very difficult work. There was no technology in the 1700s. So it was manual land clearing, manual planting, very, very difficult work. And these slaves who were transported in this way had a very short life expectancy in the Caribbean. I've heard it said they would have somewhere between 7 years, but certainly under 20. You know, they had, and so these ships kept moving. It was like bringing troops to the front lines in World War One. It was a very, very, the supply and demand was really there to meet the demand in Europe and in England for sugar. We know that William Wilberforce became involved in this, and I think and I might say too, these people here who were transported in this way, it said that they didn't see sunlight. They obviously lost a lot of weight, got scurvy, got very sick. A very, very difficult business. I've got a picture there, Meg. Maybe it's just the actors for William Wilberforce. Here we go. In the movie Amazing Grace, I haven't got an actual photo of William Wilberforce, but that's him as depicted in Amazing Grace with William Pitt, the young William Pitt, to the foreground, and he was the Prime Minister and they were good friends. So people prevailed on William Wilberforce, who is on your left, depicted on your left, to take up the slave trade. And there was a dinner party in March of 1787, and he said, look, I'll do it, providing no one more proper is found to do it. And anyway, he reluctantly or slowly agreed to this, probably not reluctantly, and he wrote in his journal in 1787, "The God Almighty has set before me two great objects, the suppression of the slave trade and the reformation of manners," which was moral values. We've also heard of John Newton, the great hymn writer, who was instrumental in Wilberforce's advocacy. And Newton was a slave trader. He ran these ships. He put people on the ships, and he became a Christian during a storm on the Atlantic. And that is well documented. It was 1748, and he became a Christian. What's a little shocking is that he didn't immediately think, okay, the slave trade's bad, I need to stop doing this. That actually didn't dawn on him for some years. We like to think it happened immediately. It actually didn't. And there's some writing somewhere, sort of storytelling of him, that he'd be riding his spiritual journey on the quarterdeck while the slaves were below. Eventually, though, and he said later in life that the reason that he didn't realise that the slave trade was wrong, was because of custom and example, and that the interest he personally had in it had blinded his eyes. But eventually, Newton did condemn the slave trade and was part of the growing anti-slave sentiment in the 1780s. And he made a public confession of his involvement, and he devoted himself to destroying the system. He gave evidence twice to committees in the House of Commons, which was how the legislation was being considered, and he encouraged William Wilberforce in what he was doing. And it's amazing that hymn, Amazing Grace, and, you know, Newton, in writing that, he didn't write it singing about the terrible things that other people had done to him. It was because of the things that he had done himself. And so I think we need grace not because of what terrible things people have done to us, but what terrible things we have done. Interesting to reflect upon. This movement did lead to the abolition of the slave trade, in 1807 in Britain and 1808 in the US. Slavery itself was abolished in 1833 in Great Britain and 1863 in the US. And, you know, that was the law. Many bad practices have continued ever since, and modern slavery is a reality as well. It's not legal, but it continues to exist in a number of industries and supply chains because of the depravity of man. So it's interesting to think about, you know, what was invisible to Newton at the time. He became a Christian, he was praying, he was writing in journals, and the English people were having lots of cups of tea with lots of sugar. And the sugar was all relatively inexpensive because of the slave labour. These people weren't bad people, many of them church-going. And you wouldn't generally speak about slavery in church because there'd be slave owners in church. So that wouldn't be done. It's interesting that the Anglican Church in March of this year have just released a report, a finding, that they were complicit in profiting from slavery in the 1700s. So they have a trust which exists, an investment trust. The predecessor of that goes way back to the 1700s. And a few years ago, there was talk about, well, hang on, I think you've profited from slavery. And they had forensic accountants over this for 4 years. They've just released a report and said, yes, we were. And as the Anglican Church, we knew what we were doing. We had interest, I think it was called the South Sea Company, and we made money out of it. The purpose of the trust was to pay for clergy. So how incredibly distorting is all of that? So it's also a little worrying that at the time, church people actually created a Bible for slaves. The Bible was headed up for slaves in East India, but it had most of the New Testament, most of the Old Testament wasn't there. Any verses that would speak about freedom or liberation were removed. This is incredible spiritual abuse, and the Anglicans have put this on display in March, saying, Christians were doing this as well, distributing this Bible to keep people oppressed. It wasn't a Bible. It was shorn of the Spirit of God, the freedom of God, designed to keep people oppressed. I'm going to finish with this verse, Galatians 5, chapter 1. For freedom Christ has set us free. Stand firm, therefore, and do not be subject again to a yoke of slavery. So we know that God is a liberator, that God wants to set all people free, wants to set us free. And it is a great encouragement to know that Christ has set us free. We should stand firm, and we should not submit to anything that would bring us into slavery. Thank you. Discuss among yourselves. God bless.